Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you don't turn off your cameras and I could see your pretty faces. As you know, it's very difficult to sit in front of a screen and there's no one behind the screen. So I don't know if you're smiling or asleep or laughing at my jokes, which is really difficult for me sometimes because I laugh pretty hard at my own jokes. So I don't know if I'm funny or not. Thank you for your time today. As Matthew said, my name is Tyesha Wood. I am a member of the Navajo Nation. I will be speaking to you. I'm not going to take the full hour because there will be questions like Matthew mentioned. There's a whole bunch of content today. You're not going to get quizzed afterwards, but we could sit for hours and hours and hours, and in fact, days. There's probably semesters given to students to understand some of the things that I'm going to bring up today. So I just, based on my experience, and I kind of just picked out a few things I thought were important enough to share with everyone. And so you guys can get a grasp of what it's like in Indian country with sex trafficking happening. Now, a little bit about myself. I am a member of the Navajo Nation and I have 4 clans because I'm full Navajo. My clans are, I'm going to say the Navajo. Yat eshe Tyesha Wood nishya, twotsone nishle, the Betlajena Bushes Chin, but Daphne Deshiche, Hashgan Zohna Deshanelle, Saiga Hodzande Nasha. And if I have any relations in the room right now or watching, please raise your hand and we'll talk after about how you can buy me a cup of coffee whenever this COVID thing lifts. I am full Navajo. I have 4 clans, and we're going to talk a little bit about the clanship system and how it works in Indian country, specifically with the Navajos, but all across the nations, tribal members have clans. So we'll talk a little bit about that. A little bit more about me. My background is in law enforcement. For 17 years, I was a tribal police officer detective, and I worked for 3 tribal nations. I worked for Salt River, Pima, Maricopa, the Navajo Nation, and the Gila River Police Department. All 3 tribal nations are in Arizona. 2 of the nations are within the vicinity of the Phoenix metropolitan area, and then the Navajo Nation, of course, is in Window Rock, which is the headquarters or the Navajo Nation capital. Of those 17 years, 12 years was investigations. I worked with family crimes and crimes against children. A majority of those times I worked within the Family Advocacy Center, which works with, as you know, works with CPS, social services, predominantly CPS workers and prosecutors. So we handle all the sex crimes and crimes against children that occurred within the jurisdiction of the tribe we worked for. This is a fairly new concept to Indian country. There's only a few tribes that have adopted and implemented their family-owned family advocacy centers, which could be one of the stronger areas in how we reclaim what is ours and reclaim our victims to, not reclaim, but I don't want to use the word to rescue, but basically acknowledge what's happening in Indian country with sex crimes. So I wanted to tell you about my first case with a sex trafficking victim. I was a detective with one of the tribes and I was presented a case. And basically as a detective, I am not the first responder, but they call me if there's a major scene, if there's a major incident and anything related to children. So I got word, I was assigned a case and it happened about 2 weeks after the incident actually happened. So when I read the case file, I retrieved the facts where I had a minor female. She was being auctioned on Facebook Live. There was a reporter, a reporting party, I'm going to say, that informed the police about this. Now, what happened basically was drugs were involved in this matter. The drug unit that I worked for pursued the matter in terms of narcotics and drugs. They knew there was a female victim involved, but that wasn't, in the eyes of the police at that time, that wasn't important. They just wanted to pursue because they had been looking for this criminal in their drug investigations. So like I said, 2 weeks later, I had a victim. She was in jail because she was a runaway. And this is the protocol for the tribe at the time. Whenever there was a habitual runaway, they would incarcerate them. So my victim was in jail, juvenile again. I did not have, my suspect had been released. And the reporting party was actually someone who didn't want to identify themselves, as they didn't want to come forward. They just wanted to acknowledge that, yes, we saw this happening on Facebook. So it was very, very difficult for me seeing that 2 weeks had since passed, and this 2 weeks, my victim was in jail the entire time. So when I started my investigation, I had to ask the Department of Corrections to bring my victim to me, and she was in handcuffs. She was in the orange suit for juvenile. Yes, again, this is the protocol for the tribal nation that I work for. One of the things that I noticed early on was, like I said, it was a drug matter. It was pursued as a drug matter. So the case was mislabeled. It should have gone to me that first day when the minor was identified and possibly involved in a sex crime. But because it was mislabeled, it just kind of was on the back burner that we had a female victim, a minor victim. So what resulted was my victim didn't want to talk to me. She was very well versed in how to respond to my questions as a police officer, as a detective. And I'm sure a lot of you who have been in this field know and understand that a lot of these times victims of sex trafficking or human trafficking, they know how to respond to questions. They know how to get away. They know how to deflect. So this was the case in this interview with my victim. She didn't provide any information. And again, my suspect had been released on his own recognizance. Of course, this was because of the criminal matter. Some things to consider. I had a reluctant victim. She didn't want to identify as a victim. I didn't have a witness because my reporting party didn't want to identify himself. I didn't have any evidence, physical evidence. I did not have, the Facebook page was not preserved. So it was just, again, they said this happened. So it's, I don't have the actual Facebook, which we can do in law enforcement. We can preserve, if we do it early enough, Facebook will work with us. So there was a lot of factors limiting what I was going to do. It didn't go well. I failed my victim. And from that day, I realized there was a lot of things that could have been better. There was a lot of things that happened that did not have to happen. And I think at sometimes we come in, and all of us here know and understand that maybe you can recall these moments in your lives where you think, you know what, it doesn't have to be this way. Let's see what we can do. And I came to that conclusion that there basically was a lack of awareness of sex trafficking happening in Indian country. And because of that, it went to a lack of awareness, a lack of education, a lack of acceptance. So I pursued the matter of, okay, let's change that. Let's start talking about these things happening in our communities. Let's start talking about these things happening within our families. And if you look in Indian country, and when I refer to Indian country, I'm talking about all the tribal nations in the United States. There's a lot happening. And we're going to go into a little bit of that cultural context, that historical context, excuse me. So of all the tribal nations in the United States, there's 574. Now, these are federally recognized. There are state tribal nations that aren't recognized, but of those 574, there's different languages, there's different laws, there's different origin stories. What I'm trying to say is, and some of you may know this, that our tribal members are work with tribal communities. You understand that not every tribe is the same. So what works for the Navajo Nation may not work for the Wind River tribal nations in Wyoming. And we definitely know what works in Wyoming will not work for the tribal nations in northern New York State. Because of who we are and where we were, and our history really has a lot to play into it. But some commonalities between all tribal nations is what brings us together. And I believe it's those trials and tribulations that we endured is why we're still here. And that's how a lot of the way we look at the world and how things happen to us from the past and how they still affect us now. That has a lot to do with what's happening now, sex trafficking, and why we can't get that awareness out there, or why we are limited in education, or why even in fact prosecution is so difficult in tribal nations. So let's talk a little bit about that historical context. From the earliest of times, you'll see that one, slavery existed, but it was not just for African Americans. It involved all minorities. You know, we heard about Asian Americans this morning. It involved Native Americans as well. From all the slavery, we'll see that there was definitely sexual exploitation happening. From the diary of Christopher Columbus, you can see that he wrote about rewarding his crew with underage girls. He talked about how easy it was for him to get underage girls to do what they want. And he would reward his crew this way. So from the very beginning, there was sexual exploitation there. From what happened then with slavery to what we see now with sex trafficking, we can see that the common factors or the elements involved include fear, fraud, force. We all know this, right? We've talked about human trafficking the past 2 days and the elements. And these things, again, this is what happened years and years and years ago with the first settlers and Native American and American Indians. And we see it now with what's happening with sex trafficking and the elements of human trafficking. I threw this in as a kind of like a public service, but it does coincide to what I'm saying. Sexual exploitation, it's still existing, not so much really in sex trafficking as much. I mean, it exists in sex trafficking, but what I'm trying to say is even things as our costumes, our mascots, this is exploitation happening. And I wanted everyone to be aware, those who don't work in tribal communities, who don't really work with or are aware of what's happening in tribal nations, these things are degrading still to us. I do not look like these people in costume. I do not have this figure. I'm 5'1". I've never worn this attire in any cultural setting, but I just wanted to enlighten everybody that this is in its truest form, exploitation of Native Americans. In my investigations, I was able to see that this was how some female victims were being identified and advertised. Native American princess. From the earliest days of Backpage, from 2012, this is how Native American girls were advertised. From 2012, so it's been happening for a while. We've been exploited for years, but Backpage we do have advertisements from Backpage happening. I didn't include it because I thought, I'm not sure where it's going to happen. I don't want to re-advertise any of that. Some other things to consider with what's still happening in today's era. So about a month ago, maybe, we all heard about what happened on the Capitol with the riots. And within that, one of the rooms in the rotunda, there are a lot of famous statues and paintings in there. And I was very lucky to work with the McCain Institute on human trafficking, education, and prevention 2 years ago. So I was relocated to Washington, D.C. So I was able to go into the Capitol. This particular painting was still in the Capitol when I left the end of 2019. It's titled The Discovery of Mississippi de Soto, 1853. Now, this is what it looks like from up front. And I stand about the bottom of that picture that you see. So it's a rather large painting. If you look closer, you'll be able to see in the circle of my slide, you'll see there's 2 Native American women there, and they have, they're only covered in their bottom, their lower half of their bodies covered. This is depicted again in the rotunda of the Capitol. And I trying to zoom in here so you guys can see what I'm talking about. So these things are still happening in our everyday world. We are still seeing these type of images depicting Native Americans. And if you look at this painting, you'll see there's only 2 Native Americans that I can identify, females, and they're surrounded by men. And this was, basically depicting what it was like back then with early colonization and how how we were greeted, or how they understood us to be Native Americans, I guess you could say. Again, that trade element there, that exploitation factor is there. So again, this is all historical context. This is what we've been dealing with. This is from years and years and years. It's been put aside quite often on retelling our story and the historical elements that are within our education system. But it's never forgotten. We still have that. And that, again, plays a role in how we deal with what we're seeing in Indian country. I don't know if you noticed, but I've been using Native American and American Indians both. There's a reason I've been using the American Indians. So Native Americans prefer either one. I mean, there's a preference all across the United States of a different in what we want to be called. I use American Indian because that's within the federal statutes. Again, my background is in law enforcement, 17 years. I handle tribal jurisdiction, state and federal. So within the federal law books, we are identified as American Indians. So if I'm going to put forth charges on a murder or a homicide or sex or rape, I have to identify as American Indian if my victim is American Indian. So I wanted to explain, even those things like that are different for us. We got to make sure we use the right wording because that's what the government called us. I alluded to the different tribes and the different origin stories. We all have different languages. We all have a different clanship. I said my 4 clans in the beginning of my presentation. I talked about who I am, and that establishes who I am in relationship to the room. I identify who my parents and my grandparents and where they come from. And the notion is everybody knows who you are. And if there is a relation in the room, you make that acknowledgement. I could travel to Portland, and I'm in Phoenix right now. I could travel to Portland, and if I say my clan, I might find a relative there. It might be someone who's younger than me, but in my clanship, they're my grandma or my grandpa. I could be somebody's sister. It's. I'm sure a few of you may have heard these connotations. It's different everywhere. Another difference is how we speak and how we view each other. When I first started law enforcement, I would respond to calls, and there would be a fight in progress, and I would respond to the call, and I'd want to find out what's happening, right? Every patrol officer is like that. Okay, give me the facts. What's happening? Who's involved? And it's 1, 2, 3, 4. When you work in Indian country, you don't get 1, 2, 3, 4. You get from what happened 3 months ago, and then we are storytellers. You may not be able to think, but I think that I'm a storyteller. But I can tell a lot of stories about other people. I'm just kidding. See, I don't know if you're laughing at my jokes or not. No, I like to laugh. I like to make people laugh. And if it means I'm going to tell a story about myself to make someone laugh, I'll tell that story. And when we're doing police investigations and we're doing interviews, I understood the importance of patience. If you get a non-Native American working in a tribal community, they don't understand that you have to listen to grandma's story from what happened 3 months ago when their siblings or her children came home. And that's when the argument or the tension began with her kids, which is why they're fighting now, right? So you got to listen to those stories. And with sex trafficking victims, a lot of law enforcement talks about, okay, be patient and listen, let them talk, let your victims talk. And that's the way we've always been, but it's not just about sex trafficking, but it's just the way our lives, our mentality, everything's in circles. It's not all linear. And when we look at sex trafficking, it's the same way, it's the same method. We just can't say, okay, well, that victim was taken from their home and then this is the solution for that. That's not the way it's going to work in Indian country. It's not the way it works in a lot of places, but I think sometimes we think, okay, it's a cookie cutter solution. So what worked in Dallas with their high-risk victims and their response, it's not really going to work for Indian country. Other things to consider is language. Like I said, everybody has different languages. From what I've known in talking with different tribal members, there's a lot of words that don't translate directly. You can have that in other languages, but the Navajo, they're very descriptive. And a lot of tribes are the same way. So there's no direct word for rape or sex in the Native American language. Sometimes I remember talking to a member of the Sioux, Oglala Sioux, and they said a long time ago, they didn't have words for thank you or please. Because when you did something for a tribal member, you did it because that was your job. If you got wood for a woman and her children because her husband wasn't there, maybe he was out hunting, but they needed wood, you did it. And it was just your role as a member of that community to provide for another community member who did not have the means to provide for themselves. So those things of thank you and please weren't acknowledged because, that was just what they had to do. So when we're applying prevention and education for people in Las Vegas or people in victims in Washington, D.C., or in fact in Portland, and we bring all those solutions back to Indian country, there may be no direct translation or direct correlation between what works for them here and what works for us as Native American communities. Because we got to think about that. Sometimes it just doesn't happen. How do we talk to our grandparents about sex if we can't describe sex trafficking, if we can't describe those words to them because there's no direct translation? I can see everybody nodding their head, right? You guys get what I'm talking about? There's differences there. So a little bit more. We talked about historical trauma. There is generational trauma. A lot of what we talked about with the words of fraud, force, and fear, those were instilled with the earliest of times, but then there was a resurface of these fears and these tactics again with what happened with our children who were forced to go to live off the reservation, move off the reservation and go to boarding schools. If you listen to First Lady Fifilia Nez, Navajo Nation First Lady Nez, she spoke this morning. She gave out some very important dates. It's a lot of information, but very important dates. And one of the things she talked about was the boarding schools and why they were enacted. So our grandparents were forced away from their homes, and they were forced into boarding schools to, again, the notion was save the man, kill the Indian. And it was them being moved away from their families. They couldn't talk their native language. They couldn't correspond. They couldn't communicate with their families. They had to live this new life. Now, does that sound familiar? Right? That sounds like sex trafficking and those people who are forced into a different world. They don't really understand what's happening. They think this is where they're supposed to be, but they're not. Some aren't allowed to talk with their families. They're not allowed to communicate with anybody. They have to basically change their lifestyle because someone else is telling them to do so. So you can see that this is happening again in tribal communities. So then we look at generational trauma. So we see grandparents living and providing for their grandkids. They may be their grandchildren's caretakers, but they see these things happening and it happened to them again. And that's generational trauma. There's a lot. How do they talk to their grandchildren about the same thing that happened to them? There's triggers there. So these are things that you have to consider when you work with tribes, especially with sex trafficking incidents and cases. I, as a Navajo woman, my family talked about our puberty ceremonies and what would happen when I became a woman. And a lot of this talk, and I'm going to talk from my experience, we didn't talk about sex in my family. I didn't hear anything about sex education from my parents. What I heard about is when you become a woman, we have to do this ceremony. So a lot of the times in tribal communities, these conversations aren't had until there's a purpose for it. So how do we educate about tribal, about sex trafficking and the elements involved, healthy relationships. You know, how do we talk about those things when sometimes in our own cultures it's shunned upon to talk about sex? It's shunned to talk. It's bad to talk about death even, and it's all about respect. It's respect for the family members, a respect for men talking to women, and vice versa. So, as a police officer, if we go back to what happened with me in my case, it was really difficult to me to talk to somebody who probably has never heard these kind of talks from somebody else, never talked about sex, never talked about rape. And even when you talk to victims and their parents, you know, there was always some kind of level of someone being uncomfortable, and they just would hold back. They didn't want to talk anymore because, one, they probably felt like they weren't supposed to, but two, it was just respect. They felt like they were disrespecting their family or something else. You know, maybe it was they were victims as well. So there's just a lot happening in tribal communities that we don't see on the surface. It's been years and years and years of people building upon this. And this is what I've seen from my experience. I, by no means, am an expert in all things tribal. If that were the case, I would be the president of the National Council of American Indians. No, I would have a crown now. No, I am not a professional, but I'm talking from my experience in my life and what I've seen on patrol. From that initial onset, I talked about how I was pursuing the fact that there needs to be more done in tribal communities based on lack of awareness. So this is what I discovered. And a lot of it had to do with what we've gone through as people. Taboos are big in Indian country and big in all communities. There's things that we can't do and we shouldn't talk about. One was death, one was sex. When I was pregnant, I have 2 children. When I was pregnant, I wasn't allowed to look at the moon. I was told, don't look at the moon. I was told I couldn't use a knife to cut meat. Someone else had to cut my meat if I were going to eat meat during dinner. And that, if we look at sex trafficking and human trafficking in communities, how do we start those conversations because of taboos? You know, we're not supposed to talk about that. Don't, Janita, don't say anything. Don't talk about it. You're going to bring it into the home. These things happen. And again, you look at how do we deal with it if, as a police officer, as a detective, how do we talk about those things when we were told not to talk about it from before, right? How do we talk about what happened to ourselves as a victim? I'm not a victim, but I'm saying those things may be difficult. And in the forms of law enforcement or in the resources, maybe advocates, and it may be difficult to talk to tribal nation victims belonging to a tribal nation because of these things. We need to adapt that. We need to adapt. So I talked a little bit about, I've been all leading towards the point that, one, yes, there's lack of sex trafficking education, there's lack of awareness. And because of all that, there's a limited response. So like I said, 2 years ago, I was in DC and I was able to work with the Health and Human Services on their prevention education, and specifically with American Indians. I was able to go to the BIA headquarters for law enforcement. And I was very fortunate enough to interview one of their higher ranked officials there. So we talked about sex trafficking, human trafficking in Indian country. And this is from the very beginning, the very onset. They've always told us there's no data saying this is happening in Indian country. And I think throughout the conference, we talk a lot about that. How do we prove it's happening if there's no data? And in Indian country, it's different. And how is it that we can't get data from tribal nations to go to Washington to report that these things are happening? And that has a lot to do with tribal nations in itself. As a police officer, I was in Arizona. I had Arizona, tribal and state and a federal jurisdiction. I could arrest and charge on those depending on what my crime involved. So for California is a PL 280 state, and that they basically allowed the state to come in and say, we will prosecute on your behalf for tribal nations. If there's a tribal victim and they were, I'm going to use the word, they were assaulted by a non-native, California state can come in and do state charges for that individual. In Arizona, that doesn't work that way. We have to determine who is Native American in the crime, the victim or the suspect. If they're both tribal members, it goes to specific court. If they're not tribal members, it goes to different court. It's confusion. It's madness. And this is all of Indian country because we have to deal with 3 jurisdictions. If they're not a public law 280 state, there's 6 states that are public, are PL 280. California is PL 280. So New Mexico and Arizona, they have tribal jurisdiction. They have BIA. Am I confusing you yet? Because it's confusing. And this is one of the pitfalls of how to prosecute sex trafficking. There are no specific laws with tribal jurisdiction on sex trafficking. So if I pursued, we go back to my first case, that tribe, because they were both tribal members, I could have charged tribally and federally. But the tribe did not have a sex trafficking code. So we would have to look at what the elements of the case and figure out which code applied to the act in itself. These are the loopholes of tribal jurisdiction. Some people may get away from, a non-native may get away from assaulting or raping or killing a native person because of these loopholes. It's very confusing. It's problematic. It's very challenging for prosecution to happen. And it's all because the United States said that we didn't have basically the means to do this. The United States took this, it went up to the Supreme Court and they argued that Native Americans, American Indians needed this help and this guidance from the federal government. Therefore, they couldn't prosecute crimes happening in Indian country. And this is what limits us in providing for ourselves and providing education, but really documenting these things. If a tribal nation does not have a code for sex trafficking or a charge for sex trafficking, how can they document it? How can they collect data, right? So if I'm interviewing the BIA official in DC and saying, these things are happening, he's like, well, there's no data for it. Well, okay, let's go all the way back down to where I worked. We didn't have a charge for it, so how can there be no data? So let's start from the bottom. Let's start with the tribal nations, say, okay, let's enact our own codes so we can start documenting these things. There's ways we can start, and it's about beginning the first steps, but it goes back to this first thing, providing awareness, knowing that these things are happening, acknowledging that these things are happening in tribal communities, and that we as a nation, tribal nations, have to start talking about how do we start protecting ourselves. I jumped ahead many slides ago. This should have been like in slide 3. We already talked about this, so you guys get an A+ on this. Now, Raina's case. So again, I wanted us to talk about how things could have been different when I first had my case, my first sex trafficking case years ago, if I knew then what I did now, pretty much yeah, let's talk about this. Let's say the tribal community I worked for had awareness. They were talking about sex trafficking happening and, the tactics used, the methods, the fact that it's happening. If they were to talk about that in the education system, if they were to start having these conversations at home within their family members, if the council delegate, which would basically be council members, if they started talking about these things happening and acknowledging that we need to protect our children, let's enact these laws, and let's get police training on how to respond to these types of crimes. Let's give school librarians the education to understand, to identify that these things are happening. Let's talk to the fire department and the medical staff. Now, all these elements are in a tribal nation because we're sovereign. We had our own medical hospital, clinic. We have our own fire department, our own police department. We have our own emergency management. We have our own schools. So why can't we help ourselves within our communities and start enacting this type of education? Why is it so difficult for us to accept that we need to move forward and kind of block the taboos that we have in our communities, block the fact yet, and I'm going to say it, we need to stop thinking about the way it was back then and start changing it to the way it is now. Sometimes a lot of people look at it saying, well, that's just the way it's always been. No, it doesn't have to be this way. It does not have to be this way. So had the community I worked for had these laws enacted, I'm sure that patrol officer that took that first case probably would have responded differently, probably would have called immediately for detectives to come out and say, you know what, I think this looks like sex trafficking, right? What do we do now? Who do we talk to? What kind of evidence do we need? What do we do with our victim? Had that victim possibly had some sort of positive intervention, maybe they would have been able to talk a little bit more. We don't even know what happened to the girl after. She kind of disappeared. And, you know, these are things, what resources would tribal nations have to develop considering all that's within that nation, meaning history, the trauma, the environment. We need to be our own saviors, really, because we know best what works for our people. We do need help. A lot of the times people have approached me and said, well, I want to help. How do we help? And there can be partnerships there. There's a lot of experience. There's a lot of times where other partners in metropolitan cities, they have the resources, they have the shelters, and sometimes they want to provide, but they don't know who to talk to in tribal nations. So we need to start developing these partnerships and start talking to other people and say, yes, we're a sovereign nation, but we still need help. Is there something we could do? And I think it's really important also that these other entities in the metropolitan areas, like for example, Phoenix, when they are contacted or they are introduced to a tribal member, it's important that these agencies consider cultural considerations when working with victims. You know, what works? Could I offer cedar, or could I offer, is there a tribal medicine man that you want to talk to? It sounds like a silly question, but it's not. That's cultural consideration, right? And maybe if that victim says, well, let's say it's a young boy and he's a victim, he says, well, my uncle is the one doing this, or is the one using me. This agency here has to know that uncle could not be a blood relationship. It could just be someone that this person has known for years and years and years, and they're considered an uncle within the family unit. You know, there's little things like that we just need to be aware of. So those resources could have been there for Raina, my victim. That's not her real name, but we'll use that name. She could have, the family, if the family was more aware that this child was a frequent runaway because of things happening in the home, she was running away from something, but she wasn't running towards the right direction. She just put herself with someone she thought loved her and was using her. You know, the education starts from the families, I think, but it develops into the whole community. So we need to start as a community, as tribal nations, this is what we need to do. We need to look for those resources. We need to develop partnerships. Our partners need to understand that we're very diverse. And if they just includes, can I take a cultural education class with your community? Is that offered? Or how do I go about responding? Or, what are some ideas? So those of you who work with tribal nations, get to know the tribal nation that's near you. Get to understand what their dynamics are, even just understanding their laws and their jurisdiction. I think that shows a lot for someone who's reaching out and asking you for help. Then you're like, oh yeah, you know what? I read about this and this is, maybe this could happen. I think those are the stronger points of finding solutions for tribal communities. Just so you know, there's this case on the bottom, Oliphant versus Suquamish. This is the the Supreme Court case law that basically binds the hands of tribal jurisdiction. This says that tribal nations cannot or do not have powers to incriminate or charge someone who's non-tribal. It has to go to the federal courts. So I thought that was very important. So once tribal nations change this law, takes it and fights it and says, no, we should be able to charge non-tribal members for committing crimes within our nation. That could be helpful too, but the United States government feels that, again, still we don't have, we're not capable of doing this. Just a little thing I'm not too fond of. Just thought I'd throw it out there to share. A little bit about the events that you may have heard about. There's a big awareness happening across the United States surrounding missing and murdered Indigenous people. There's a couple acronyms here: missing and murdered Indigenous women, missing and murdered Indigenous persons and children. Whether the name, whatever acronym that is near you or that you've heard of, the idea basically is that we need to bring more awareness to what's happening in Indian country. There's no direct correlation with sex trafficking and the movement, the missing and murdered Indigenous women movement. Missing and murdered is the two key words. And what everybody is wanting to share is that there have been people missing from tribal communities. There are people that are being murdered in tribal communities, and they have slipped through those loopholes I talked about. There's no prosecution. There's no bodies. So therefore, there's no evidence that a crime has been committed. So there's just a staggering number of missing people from tribal communities. This may be related to sex trafficking and victims being lured off their homelands to do work elsewhere. There are stories, there's a lot of, there are books, there are articles that have been written by survivors saying, this is what happened to me. And some of it has to do with the access, the pipelines, the man camps. In Canada, there was a freight liner that would go from the Canadian border all the way down to New Orleans. I remember hearing a woman talk about how it was just a party. They were told to go on the boat and there would be a big party. So they would be lured to the boats. And then next, days later, they're being pushed and forced off in New Orleans. These are all personal accounts. They've been happening for years. But this awareness that of missing and murdered, it's everywhere. There's no one national group, but again, the premise is the same, that there needs to be more awareness that these things are happening in Indian country. And this morning and during the panel, they talked about the high number of minority groups who are involved in these crimes that are not talked about. And this is just another aspect of that. I'm not an expert in this, but there have been several good works done on missing and murdered, and I've listed them on this slide here. There's a website for this particular study, and Anita, she's been working years on gathering data of who has gone missing within certain states and what happened with those cases. But this is some other resources that if you want to read up on it, this is a very credible source here. She does a lot of speaking engagement. She's very busy, but she has been able to talk more about her study in person. So if you're ever interested, there are a few things you may be able to catch on YouTube. It's about time to wind down. When I was first asked to do this presentation, I was really excited, but I had a lot of trouble figuring out what to share and what to talk about, because I think all of it's important, and I think a lot of us here within the the conference, there's a lot of good data. There's stuff that we've heard before. There's stuff that we haven't heard before. And I think one of the things that we as a community that all understand is that there's partners out there, there's resources out there that we don't know about. There's things that we could share, and there's things that we could take. And I'm not a survivor. I am, my background's in law enforcement. So I would kind of say I'm kind of like an educator. And I want to educate more. I want to talk to tribal communities about regaining their cultural identity to fight, to combat sex trafficking. And I think that we have that in us. We have, and not just minorities or American Indians, but we as a people. It's about finding those strengths and finding that, what can I offer to save people? What can I offer to save my community? So understanding what's happening in the country it could be a whole semester long about what happened way back then, what we see now, what happened then, and how it affects what we do now in our communities or sex trafficking. I wanted you to understand that it's different for Native Americans because of so many reasons, because of our language, because of our history, because of what we've been through. And what works as solutions sometimes is not so open, it's not available, like Las Vegas, there's partnerships, there's shelters. But if we apply that to Indian country and just kind of do cookie cutter, it's not going to work. But that doesn't mean it's impossible. For those Native Americans and those American Indians that are listening, how do we start these conversations in our homes? How do we start talking about these things happening with our kids? How do we protect our children? How do we talk about social media? How do we get our grandparents involved in these conversations? Because maybe they have some insight on how they survived those many years ago to what we can do now. We are the pillars of every community. We are the people that are going to stay for the long haul, right? Because you guys are here on a Saturday afternoon. That tells me that you guys are serious about finding solutions, are serious about combating sex trafficking and human trafficking. And I say, let's join hands. There's not one set, like Native Americans all to the side, Hispanics all to the side. No, we are all fighting the same fight. I just wanted everyone to understand a little bit more about American Indians in general. I can't speak for all 574 nations, but I can speak on what I've seen in the tribal communities that I've worked for. Matthew, believe I have this, you guys can't see, but I got this big screen saying time's up, time's up, time's up. Matthew's like pulling the hook, pushing me off. Okay, there's questions. Do you have any questions?
Yeah,
Comments?
so we have some questions in the chat. So I guess to start off, someone said that they're pretty confused and they know that the Navajo Nation covers at least 3 states, and each of those states have different laws, but they are prosecuted by Navajo Nation.
Yes, I acknowledge I probably added more confusion to this already confusing web of jurisdiction matters. So the Navajo Nation has their tribal laws, they have state laws, and then there's federal guidelines and federal charging that could occur. The Navajo Nation has powers over crimes that are committed of a minor offense. And with respect to if the victim is Native American Indian, and the suspect is American Indian, the tribe can pursue matters. So let's talk about an assault. Somebody got hit by a bat. The tribe can take that because there's 2 Native Americans involved. It can go to federal court because there's 2 Native Americans involved. In some jurisdictions, let's say a non-Native hit someone else with a bat, a Native with a bat. For the tribes that I work for in Phoenix, that particular case would have to go to the county for charging. We couldn't arrest within the tribal. They can't stay in our jail. The feds would consider it because it's a non-tribal suspect. But really the federal, they've got bigger crimes than assault. So then you go to the state and the state will be like, my victim, I can't find my victim, or my victim is unreliable because they've had all these prior incidents. So we're just going to throw this out. So then basically the tribal member who's a victim will go back and say, well, nothing happened. I got hit by a bat, but nothing happened. So that's just an example of, I explained what happens with a bat, but what if it's rape? What if it's murder? And these are the loopholes that I've seen in Indian country as a law enforcement. So Navajo Nation, those considerations have to be made, but for California, the state would take jurisdiction because they're pre-L 280. There's even, just to add to the confusion, there are even states like in Oklahoma that are checkerboard. Like you could literally cross the street and you would be in state jurisdiction. And then you take 2 steps to the left and then you're back in Indian country, but it's of a different tribe. So there's checkerboard jurisdiction as well. I know that's probably confusing, but look at Google it. Or email me after and we'll talk about it. We'll have a little bit more discussion on this. It is confusing. I'll do my best to explain it offline.
Wow, so informative. And we do have a lot of work to just be educating ourselves in that area and looking at different policies and laws and jurisdictions from tribes to tribe. Another question that came in, someone asked that they were curious if there's a particular prevention education for Native American youth that has been identified as more culturally relevant.
When I worked in DC, when I was working with Health and Human Services, they were doing a lot of program development with Native Americans. There's a Blue campaign, but there was actually the group out of DC, Center for Native American Youth, CNAY. They were also doing some curriculum development specific to tribal nations. And their concept back then, I don't recall if it ever lifted off, but they were trying to get youth ambassadors to learn and sit through human trafficking training so that they could go home and talk to their peers about this. So there have been some development, and I know it's a worthy concept. I think that's great if you get your own youth to talk to the youth about what's happening and how to respond. I think that's another question youth need to start talking about, because a teenager will tell another teenager, hey, this is happening. It's important the teenagers know, well, how do I respond to that? If someone tells me something's happening to them, how do I respond? What do I say to help my friend or my family member? Again, that could be curriculum we talk about too and develop.
Thank you. In the chat, there's another question too that popped up that says, the gaps that have been noted in this presentation, and considering the sovereignty of each nation, the cultural differences between tribes in varying laws, etc., are these gaps better addressed within each tribe? It seems like a huge job considering there are 574 tribes. Is there any central body such as the BIA that could provide some relevant and appropriate shortcuts to addressing gaps, that is with disregarding culture, or that is without disregarding culture, traditions, and so forth?
As law enforcement, when I was working in the area that I knew the jurisdictional powers that I have. So law enforcement should already be educated, and they should know where they can prosecute certain crimes and how to move forward with charging with those jurisdictions. BIA, I worked for tribal police. There's also BIA who come on to tribal nations when they don't have adequate police staff or even police there. So BIA will assume those duties. Some tribes don't work with BIA because they're sovereign and they have their own police department. So no, to answer the question, there is no one overlying law enforcement jurisdiction besides the federal government coming in and saying, this is how you do, this is what you do, and this is how you do it. And then you got to understand the predicament that puts tribal nations in, because now we have the government saying, hey, this is what you have to do now. It's confusing. And I think, again, it would go back to a community level. Each community knows their laws, knows their lands, knows their people, and they would have to designate, say, okay, let's just start protecting our own. And then other tribal nations can look at them and say, okay, you guys did well on this. Could we look at it? And could you share information? So not every tribal nation should reinvent the wheel, right? Maybe they could just adapt to another area. But I think that the strongest point is just tribal nations in the 574 develop their own protection, unfortunately.
Thank you, Tyesha. Another question we have, and then we have about time for another question if somebody wants to type in there, or we can stay a little bit into our break as we're going to be done in a couple minutes. But the next question is, one thing that my organization has run into is being turned down for not having a Native presenter. We would love to present to our local Indian school, but we were told basically to come back with someone who was Native to talk to kids. Even though I'm Native, my family has been off the rolls for 4 generations. I've been working for 2 years trying to find that person in my area, but I am having no luck. Any advice on how to get more Native people on board? Thank you. And she's located in Oklahoma.
More buy-in. Yes, there's, I put my email in the chat for everyone. If you want to talk later or connect later, we can definitely have some phone calls. I would love to speak with you more on that. There are a few people I've met in Oklahoma that could help. Yeah, well, there are people who are willing to help your tribe and your nation. I could help you look for them, or I could help you. We're all in this together, right?
Yes, awesome. Well, thank you so much, Tyesha. And if anybody else has any other questions they'd like to ask, we can do about one more before we go into our break. And if not, this will kind of conclude the presentation. And Tyesha, we just wanted to say thank you so much for being a part of this conference and talking to us about this subject. And I know, like, I'm learning a lot too as a Navajo student at Vanguard, and being able to partner with the Office of the First Lady and Second Lady this year with the Global Center has been just amazing. So yeah, so a lot of thank yous here. And then for our participants, if you have any questions for Tyesha, you can email her or on the HOVA app to ask those questions. And it looks like we got another question, I think. Tyesha, maybe explain why they would request a Native rep for those that don't understand that.
Okay. There are some tribal communities, because of, you know, the historical context we alluded to. There's uncertainty there between tribal and non-tribal. Sometimes there's just that factor of not trusting, you know, outsiders. And I wanted to throw this in there. Yes, that could be the case, but also in law enforcement, I began my career with a tribe that I was not from. I started in with the Salt River Pima Miracle, but I'm a member of the Navajo Nation. So what I would see is the tribal members here in the community when I started, yeah, in 01. So we would respond to a call and a non-native would respond. And I would see taunting of the non-native saying, oh, you're a reject from the city. That's why you're working for the tribe. That's why you're here. Oh, you don't know what you're doing. So then they would send a native. So I would show up, right? And then I would be the reject because I'm not from the tribe. They would say, even though I'm Native American, they would say, well, you know, go back to your own tribe. You know, why do you work here? Why don't you work for your own tribe? And then a tribal member from that community would respond to the call and they'd show up, and then they would be taunted and be told you're a traitor because you're a police officer. So I wanted to acknowledge sometimes even Native Americans aren't welcome within a certain tribe. Even those tribal members from a tribe may not be welcome. And not everybody thinks this way, but there are always people, there are a few individuals who, you know, are just never satisfied. And I just want to acknowledge it's it's not just against non-natives. It could be against natives as well. Unfortunately, that's just the mentality of some people. But with respect to the initial question, there are other natives that want to help. They might not belong to that group, but they want to help and they want to offer advice. But those barriers, I think, need to just be broken in so many avenues. We talked a lot about systemic racism earlier, but we all understand that. We all know that, it exists, and how do we fight those things? It's just getting to know community and not just regarding what they can offer. I had so much fun, guys. I really wish I could see your faces. I can't wait till that day happens where we actually see each other in person. Please be well, be safe. Contact me if you have questions. If you have arguments, I'm free to talk. Let's discuss these things. Let's find solutions for each other through dialogue.
Thank you so much. Well, that is all of our time, and I know there's like another question. So Stephanie, if you want to stay a little bit longer, I'm going to end this recording. So for any of the other participants, if you want to take a break and then log on to our next plenary session, it's going to be amazing. So thank you all for joining us. You're free to go. And if you want to stay for a couple more minutes, Tyesha can answer this next question.